My family's hands stopped at dinner when I said I'd just sold the farm they planned to steal from me tonight. I first noticed it in the way conversations broke like glass the second I stepped into a room. My mother's voice would trail off mid-sentence. My aunt, who normally filled every silence with chatter, suddenly found the rim of her coffee cup fascinating. My uncle, the kind of man who always had an opinion ready, would start flipping through his phone as if a news alert had just arrived. At first, I convinced myself it was paranoia. Family gossip was like weather, always shifting, always swirling, rarely worth tracking unless a storm was coming. But this felt deliberate. Patterns started to emerge. They'd meet without me on Sunday afternoons, gatherings I'd hear about only after they happened. When I did get invited, their questions about the farm came wrapped in casual tones that were just a little too careful. The farm. Grandpa's land wasn't just dirt and crops. It was the kind of property that had a personality, a stubborn old soul that had endured generations of weather, bad harvests, and family squabbles. It wasn't much in the eyes of anyone outside our bloodline, but inside it was sacred, or so I thought. For most of my life, I believed we all felt the same way about it, that Grandpa's will naming me as the sole heir was less about favoritism and more about trust. He had always said I was the one who saw the land the way he did. The others? They saw a patch of earth. I saw a living thing. But over the months, that trust felt less like an honor and more like a spotlight. I noticed glances between cousins when I mentioned repairs I was making. My aunt's questions about how much work it must be started sounding less like concern and more like gentle pressure. And then there were the phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear, my mother's voice low in the kitchen saying, "We just have to get him to see reason." I ignored it at first. I told myself they were just speculating, talking about possibilities. Until the afternoon my cousin Jake dropped by. It was unannounced, which wasn't unusual for him, but he was jumpy in a way that didn't match his usual laid-back attitude. We sat in the kitchen, him pretending to be interested in the sports highlights playing on the TV, until he excused himself to use the bathroom. When he came back, his backpack was in a slightly different position than when he'd set it down. Not much, but enough for me to notice. And something in me, that old instinct Grandpa used to call my farm sense, told me to check it. He'd barely driven away when I unzipped it. Inside, beneath a few books and a sweatshirt, was a manila folder. I pulled it out. The paper inside was thick, legal grade. My name was at the top, and below it a signature, Mine, except it wasn't. It was close, eerily close, but the pen pressure was wrong. The angle of the T in my last name slanted in a way I'd never written. It was a sale contract. The farm, my farm, was to be transferred to a prearranged buyer for an amount that was far below what it was worth. And the date? Finalization was scheduled for tonight. After dinner, I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange calm. No anger, no panique, just confirmation. The whispers hadn't been about possibilities. They'd been about plans. My family, the people who'd smiled with me at Grandpa's funeral, who'd toasted me when I took over the land, had been plotting to take it from me, and they thought I wouldn't see it coming. By the time evening rolled around, I had my own plan. I didn't call anyone out. I didn't confront Jake. I didn't even move the papers from where I'd found them. I just put the folder back in his bag exactly the way it had been. If they wanted to play this game in silence, I'd play along. Dinner was at my aunt's house. She was the unofficial hub of family gatherings, large kitchen, plenty of space, and a way of making her home feel warm even when her smile wasn't. When I arrived, the smell of roast chicken hung in the air. My mother greeted me with a hug that lasted a second too long, the kind that feels less affectionate and more like a scan for your mood. "Glad you could make it," my uncle said from the doorway. His tone was light, but his eyes flicked toward my cousin for a half second. I smiled as if nothing was off. The table was already set, every place marked with a cloth napkin folded into a triangle. My seat was at the far end, directly across from Uncle Mark, the man I knew would try to lead the conversation where they wanted it to go. We made small talk over salad. They asked about the weather, the crops, how the repairs on the barn were going. I answered easily. giving them just enough detail to keep them from sensing the edge beneath my calm. The main course came out, dishes passed hand to hand, laughter breaking out at little jokes. It could have been any other night if I didn't know what was waiting after dessert. Halfway through the meal, right when everyone's plates were still half full and attention was loosening, my uncle cleared his throat. "We've been talking," he began, voice steady but with a note of something rehearsed, "about the future of the farm." I set down my fork, meeting his eyes. "Don't worry about it," I said, keeping my tone casual, almost bored. "I sold it this morning." The reaction was instant. My mother froze, hand halfway to her mouth. My aunt's fork clinked against her plate. Jake looked like he'd just swallowed a stone. "What?" my aunt blurted. "Yeah," I said, leaning back slightly. "Got a good price. Buyer wired the funds an hour ago." I let that sink in before adding, "It's going to be turned into a wildlife reserve. No one here will ever touch it." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that comes from shock alone. It was the kind that comes from a plan collapsing in real time. I could almost hear the gears grinding in their heads, trying to recalibrate. Mark's jaw tightened. You can't just." "I can," I said evenly. And I did. My aunt looked at my mother, searching for some unspoken signal. Jake shifted in his seat, his hands twitching near his lap. I could see it on their faces. The realization that all those whispered meetings, all those careful arrangements had been for nothing. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The damage was done, and every second of that silence was mine. And in the back of my mind, I pictured Grandpa. I could see the way his eyes would crinkle when he was proud. If he'd been sitting at that table, he would have been smiling. No one touched their plates after that. The roast chicken sat cooling in the center of the table, the steam fading like the warmth in the room. My uncle was the first to move, leaning back with his arms crossed, staring at me like he was deciding whether to argue or wait. "You sold it without telling anyone?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was clipped, each word carrying weight. "It was mine to sell," I said. My mother leaned forward, her tone softer but with a thread of accusation. "That land's been in the family for over a century. You didn't think we'd have an opinion." "I'm sure you had one," I said. I just didn't need to hear it. Jake shifted in his seat, eyes darting to his bag near the wall. He must have been wondering if I'd seen the papers. I didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing. Mark pressed on. "Who's the buyer?" "A conservation group. They'll preserve the land, turn it into a wildlife reserve. No farming, no building. It stays untouched." Aunt Linda's fork clattered as she set it down. "So you're telling us, after everything this family has done for that land, you just handed it over to strangers?" I kept my voice steady. "Better strangers than vultures." That broke the thin hold on the room. Mark's face flushed, Linda's mouth tightened into a hard line, and my mother sat back, lips pressed together, watching me like she was trying to read my next move. Dinner ended early. No dessert, no polite goodbyes. I walked out into the night with the cold air cutting sharper than usual, the sound of the front door closing behind me like a final note. Driving back to the farm, the headlights cut through the gravel dust. I could still picture their faces, a mixture of disbelief and calculation. They weren't done. That much I knew. My move had ruined their immediate plan, but people who spend months plotting don't just stop when they hit a wall. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on. The old farmhouse stood silent, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. I locked up, double-checking the doors and windows. Not because I thought they'd break in tonight, but because trust had shifted. This wasn't family anymore. This was opposition. The next morning started earlier than usual. My phone buzzed before sunrise, a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring out, but a voicemail followed. It was short. "We need to talk. You made a mistake." The voice was male, unfamiliar, but the tone was confident. An hour later, while I was in the barn, another call came in. This time, it was my mother. "Come to my house this afternoon," she said. "We can't leave things like this." I told her I was busy. She didn't argue, just hung up. That told me more than anything she could have said. They weren't inviting me to talk. They were summoning me. By noon, I had company. A black SUV I didn't recognize pulled into the drive. The man who stepped out wasn't family. Late 40s, clean suit, hair slicked back. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not on a gravel road. "Mr. Harper?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm representing your family in a property matter." He spoke like every word was chosen in advance. "I understand you've sold the farm." "That's right." He glanced around, taking in the land like he was appraising it. "Our concern is whether the transaction was legal." It was. "You didn't notify them. That could be challenged." I stepped closer. "Let me guess. They sent you here to scare me into changing my mind." He gave a polite smile. "I'm here to avoid unnecessary conflict. I think we're past that point." He left after 15 minutes. No threats, no paperwork. But the way he'd scanned the property before leaving told me he wasn't just there to talk. He was taking notes. That night, I found tire tracks near the back fence, fresh ones. No one had business back there except me. 2 days later, I got a letter. Not from a lawyer, from my mother. Handwritten. Short. "You've put yourself in the middle of something bigger than you know. You need to reconsider." I didn't respond. The calls kept coming. Some from family, some from blocked numbers. The message was always the same. Meet, talk, reconsider. But they weren't asking, they were circling. Then Jake showed up again. This time, he didn't come to the door. I saw him from the upstairs window, standing by his truck, staring at the house like he was deciding whether to knock. After a minute, he got back in and drove off. The following evening, I got proof of what I'd suspected. The conservation group I'd sold the farm to sent me an email, nothing alarming, just a status update. But attached was a note from one of their representatives. Someone claiming to be a relative of mine had contacted them directly, asking about the possibility of reversing the sale. They'd even offered to match the purchase price. I called the representative immediately. "Tell them no, and don't take another call from anyone connected to me." The next week was a test of patience. I stayed busy, kept the gates locked, and avoided any direct meetings. But every time I left the property, I had the sense I was being followed. On Friday night, that suspicion turned solid. I caught sight of Mark's car parked down the road, far enough that he might think I wouldn't notice, close enough to watch. He didn't come up the drive, just sat there for an hour before leaving. By the weekend, the tone shifted. My aunt called, no pleasantries, just, "This isn't over." The calls stopped on Monday. No letters. No cars on the road outside the farm. For 2 days, it was quiet, too quiet. I knew the silence wasn't surrender. It was a reset. They were planning something that wouldn't give me time to react. On Wednesday morning, it came, a knock at the door. Not hesitant, not rushed, deliberate. When I opened it, Mark was standing there, dressed in his work jacket, hands in his pockets. Behind him, a man in a gray suit and a woman holding a folder. "We need to talk," Mark said. Not interested. "You should be," the woman cut in. "We're here on behalf of the county. There's been a review of the sale you made." The suit handed me a letter. It was on county letterhead, claiming the transaction might be invalid due to heritage status review, a convenient term I'd never heard used for this property. I read it twice, then looked at Mark. "Nice try," I said, handing it back. "This is official," the woman replied. "If the review finds in favor of your relatives, the sale could be overturned." I didn't argue. I closed the door. That evening, I called the head of the conservation group. He confirmed they'd received a similar letter, anonymous, no return address, but worded exactly the same. It was clear now. They'd found a new angle, and it involved dragging this into a government process that could last months. I had no intention of letting it get that far. The next morning, I drove into town. I visited the county records office, pulled every file connected to the farm, and requested copies. The clerk didn't blink, which told me nothing unusual had been flagged. Yet, I left with a folder of documents and one certainty: the letter was a bluff. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one they couldn't recover from. The following week, I asked the conservation group to issue a public statement, full press release, complete with photos of the land, a breakdown of their plans, and my own written endorsement. The local paper ran it on the front page. The story painted the farm as a community win, a preservation effort that would protect wildlife and honor Grandpa's legacy of stewardship. Every word was true, and every sentence locked the sale in tighter. The backlash hit them before the paper even went to print. I heard from a neighbor that Linda had been approached to the grocery store and asked why she'd try to stop such a wonderful thing. Mark was seen in town looking like he'd swallowed something sharp. 2 days later, Jake showed up again. This time, he came to the door. "Look," he said, "I didn't want it to go this way." "You forged my signature," I said flatly. He looked at the ground. "That wasn't me. Your bag, your papers. Don't insult me." He didn't argue. "They're not going to stop," he said finally. "They already have," I told him. "They just don't know it yet." He left without another word. That night, I put the final part of my plan into motion. I had spoken with a lawyer weeks ago, quietly, after finding the forged contract. I kept it in my back pocket in case things escalated. Now, it was time to use it. The lawyer filed a formal complaint with the state against unknown parties for attempted fraud related to the sale of the property. Attached were photographs of the forged document and a sworn statement from me. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. The implication was enough. Within a week, investigators contacted me. They wanted to see the original papers I'd found. I told them exactly where they were, still in Jake's bag. They didn't need a warrant. He'd brought it onto my property. When the officers arrived at his place, the story shifted quickly. Jake claimed ignorance, said someone must have slipped it into his things. But his prints were on the folder, and the timeline fit. Whether he acted alone or took the fall didn't matter to me. The investigation made my family scatter. Mark stopped coming into town. Linda avoided anyone she knew at the store. My mother called once, left a short message. "I hope you're happy." I didn't call back. The county never followed up on the fake heritage review. The letter was traced back to a rented mailbox in the next town over, paid for in cash, no name attached. But the damage was done. They couldn't touch the land, couldn't undo the sale, and now they had bigger problems to deal with. The farm wasn't mine anymore, but it was safe. The conservation group began moving in equipment to start restoration work. I visited once, walking the familiar fields, listening to the wind through the grass. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like closure. I didn't see my family again. No reunions, no holiday calls. The silence was final this time, and I welcomed it. As I left the farm for the last time, I passed the old gate. Grandpa had built it himself, the wood weathered, but still strong. I stopped, resting a hand on it. "They thought they could take it from me," I said quietly. "They never understood. It was never just land." Then I got in my truck and drove away, the road stretching ahead, clear and open. Behind me, the farm stood untouched, exactly as it should be. And nothing they could do would ever change that.